Good evening and welcome to New York Buddha Dharma. Everybody. Tonight we are continuing our progress through Volume 1 of Chogyam Trungpa's The Profound Treasury of the Ocean of Dharma. Volume 1 is on the Hinayana stage of the path, and we're almost to the end. Only a few more chapters. After which we're going to switch into his first book, Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, which will be a very interesting contrast. That book was put together in 1971 and has been around for a long time and has sold a lot of copies and had a big impact, it seems. At the time, there was so little in this country presenting the true Dharma. And when Trungpa Rinpoche arrived, his voice was very powerful. In fact, the very first talk that was given here at New York Buddha Dharma was entitled Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, the Padmasambhava of our time. Padmasambhava brought Buddhism to Tibet in the 8th century A.D., and he was an extraordinary and powerful teacher. Actually, Buddhism had arrived somewhere around 620, maybe. That's the traditional dates, and sort of had a very weak beginning until Padmasambhava arrived. There was a king at that time named Trisang Detsen who was a devoted Buddhist, and he invited first a Mahayana teacher named Shantarakshita. And when Shantarakshita couldn't quite get the job done, Shantarakshita told him, you should invite this other fellow named Padmasambhava. And looking back, I feel Trungpa Rinpoche really is the Padmasambhava of our time. There were many other teachers, some of them very fine, although relatively few that fit into that category of fine. I think only really of Suzuki Roshi. And so it was very important. And this book has sold over, certainly over 400,000, probably upwards of 500,000 copies in the last 40 or 50 years. And there are many people that I've run into who say that it introduced them to Buddhism or introduced them to Tibetan Buddhism. So we're going to do that after this. And there are some things in that book that are so deep and so profound. His presentation of emptiness is still, I think, one of the finest short presentations in print. He does it by means of analysis of the Heart Sutra. So tonight we are coming towards the end of the talks on the Hinayana. These talks were given at seminaries, they were called, seminary. Starting in 1973, Trungpa Rinpoche took anywhere from 120 to 250 or so of his students away for 3 months at a time, and during that period of time gave teachings. And these teachings have been available to a limited degree, especially he divided the 3 months up into 3 parts, Hinayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. And the Vajrayana was restricted to people who had been to one seminary or another. You couldn't get access until you had done that. But he also left instructions in his will that at some point in the future, those teachings would become available to the public. And that time has been reached, and Volume 3 of The Profound Treasury deals with the Vajrayana. And up at the Westchester Buddhist Center, where I also teach with Derek Kalini, we worked our way through the first 2 volumes and launched into the third. And about 40% of the way in, we stopped. We felt it was just too much for the audience that we had. It required too much background in Vajrayana lore. And most of the people that were coming, if they had any Vajrayana experience at all, it was beginning. They were doing their preliminary practices. And so the discussion of creation and completion exercise, practices, and much less Mahamudra and Sokchen was too much, and we stopped. But that's there in that volume, and you can buy it at Amazon if you wish. But I find this, in preparing tonight, on the end of the Hinayana section, extraordinarily profound, because he always taught from the end of the path. It's like the perspective that he brings is the perspective of an enlightened person, or a near enlightened person. It's very advanced, this presentation of beginning doctrine. So, there are three ways to schematize the path. One is in terms of the Hinayana, the lesser vehicle. Yana means vehicle. The Mahayana, the greater vehicle. Maha means greater, great. Or the Vajrayana, the adamantine vehicle. And these are progressive, these three vehicles. You can do Vajrayana practices when you've been introduced to them with a beginner's mind, a Hinayana mind. But nonetheless, you're still bringing that beginning understanding to them. The other path, the other scheme, is the one that we're going to start with tonight. Or actually, we've already started with it, but we're going into more detail. And that's what's called the 5 paths. And the first of these paths is the path of accumulation. That's what it's called. The second is the path of unification. The third is the path of vision. The fourth is the path of meditation. And the fifth is the path of an enlightened person. It's the path of no more learning, it's called. And we are on the very first one. In fact, and that path, the path of accumulation, is divided into 3. The lesser, middle, and greater paths of accumulation. And we're starting with the lesser. I found it very challenging reading this and thinking about it and trying to prepare to give it. I mean, it's I'll do my best. So, when we enter the path, we are primarily working with very beginning Buddhist doctrine. Again, I laugh. The beginning Buddhist doctrine that we're dealing with in particular in the path of accumulation are the 3 marks of existence, which are impermanence, egolessness, and suffering. And the teaching of the Four Noble Truths, the truth of suffering, the origin of suffering, the cessation, that there is a cessation to suffering, and the path to that cessation. And also, we're dealing with the 4 foundations of mindfulness. Tonight we're dealing mainly with the first of these, the 3 marks of existence: impermanence, egolessness, and suffering. And I had never heard this before, but there is a progression, a sequence to this, that, according to Rinpoche, that one first understands impermanence. And then one understands, you would think it would be suffering, right? Something that's immediately available. But it's not. It's egolessness. And those two, the deeper your understanding becomes of them, the more you can understand suffering, which is key, that our lives are permeated, drenched in suffering. And we are so lost in thought, in reflection, that we hardly notice it because we're dreaming. We're lost in stories. It's kind of like when you were sitting. It's not kind of, it is like when you were sitting, and I might say, whatever you're thinking, come back, to your awareness and see it. And you realize, we all do, that you've been completely lost in a dream. You've been off in Poughkeepsie having a conversation with your mother or wherever, whatever it might be. And when you're doing that, you're gone. And then you come back and you say, oh yeah, and you're back for however long. Might just be a second, might be a little while. You're back in the clarity of this present moment, and you can see that the dream was happening, and you can let it go. Now, if you start to judge yourself at that point, that's another dream. You've just launched into another one. So the key here is awareness, seeing it and then relaxing into the open awareness of this present moment. That's great practice. And what's not great practice is if you sort of mentally whip yourself and say, I've got to try harder, I'm being a bad meditator, I'll never get anywhere with this, I don't even know if this makes sense. And you have all this conversation with yourself having to do with judgment of yourself and your practice. You let that, and if you do that, you see that and let it go and come back to this open awareness. And the irony is that, well, let's go. We'll start in on it. He says meditation at this stage is developing greater mental and psychological sharpness so that the teachings in the world are seen properly. That's the practice that we're doing, that we were just doing now, developing greater mental and psychological sharpness. You are becoming aware of your psychological hang-ups and confusions, which you're not even aware of when we're dreaming them, and discovering all kinds of insights into the teachings. And you see these insights and they make sense to you. They apply to your experience. The analogy for this practice, for this process at this time, is of a mirror that is dusty, and you're cleaning the dust off. You're not seeing anything transcendent at this point. You're not discovering nirvana, or non-duality. You're just seeing, in fact, primarily, what one is discovering is suffering and confusion. Most people, when they walk down the street, barely know, that they're suffering and are confused. He says, what you see here is not so much a glimpse of enlightenment as it is what is wrong with samsara. And this awareness is produced by vipassana meditation. Vipassana is the open awareness of space that we were doing. Shamatha is the focus on an object. So when the breath went out into that space, that was the shamatha element. It went out and dissolved. And when it dissolved and you were right back here in the space, wide open, awake, aware of this room, that's the vipassana. We can practice vipassana all the time. It's the key practice. It goes all the way to the end of the path to enlightenment itself. It just changes its name. It's the same practice. It becomes greater vipassana, mahavipassana. It becomes shunyata meditation. It becomes mahamudra, and it becomes dzogchen, and it's all the same. It is learning how to relax into an open awareness, effortless awareness of the present moment. It's effortless because it's already there. We don't have to make it. We're just clearing away the debris of our mental confusion, our mental stuff, so that we can then rest in that open awareness that is part of us. It's our being. It's what we are. It's so terrific. He says, and you not only do all that, but you also, at this stage of the path, begin to develop artistic sensibility. And you begin to appreciate, because you're coming back in this open awareness, you begin to appreciate the beauty and the sharpness and the vividness of this world as it occurs in the present moment. Much more than before, because before we were walking along in this fog of dream, walking along worrying about paying the rent, worrying about being loved, worrying about whatever. And when that starts to clear, even just for moments, we begin to see this world much more clearly. Those dreams are like sunglasses. They filter out the beauty of the world, or the vividness. Because sometimes it might be a dog shit in the street that you're looking at, and it's vivid. It doesn't have to be sort of some classic idea of beauty. He said, this is interesting, there's a need for faith and devotion at this point. And this faith is partly blind. It's blind because you're not certain what you're getting yourself into in the beginning of the path. We all know this. It makes sense, to us, but we're not quite really sure what we're getting into with this. Is it the real thing? is this a hoax? Is this some guy having me on? Sort of creating a disciple-student relationship, teacher relationship. And he said it's partly intelligent because you know what you want to get out of, and you're nauseated by it. Samsara. The pain of samsara, the neurosis, the neurotic mind, So that's the intelligent part of it. So you're taking a chance, and faith becomes important. It's faith in the Buddha as an example of someone who did it. Faith in the Dharma, the teachings, that these are actually making sense to you and are going to have a beneficial effect. And faith in the community of people that tread the path, that can support you and give you encouragement and friendship. He says, devotion to the lineage. That's the lineage of teachers. We begin to study the lineage when we get in here and we see, so for instance, the Kagyu lineage. The first Kagyu person was Marpa, Tibetan, the translator who went to India and became a student of the great Indian Siddha, that means power holder, enlightened person, Naropa, excuse me. And he came back to Tibet with all these teachings, and he became a great teacher, and he had students. Most famous of his students was Milarepa, who, is he here? Well, no, he's not. No, that's Tara. He's often green, Milarepa. And Milarepa had the student Gampopa, was his primary student, but he also had another one named Rinchungpa and so forth. And it went down all the way to the Karmapas, and we have now with us alive in this world the 17th Karmapa, who is the 17th head of the Kagyu sect. Oh, thank you. Songs of Realization. Here's Milarepa. He sang his teachings. See? So there he is. He's holding his hand to his ear because he's listening to himself sing, so that he can hear it. And he's got this belt here. You see that strap? That's a meditation belt. That's so that you can meditate 24/7 without falling down. It's supposed to help keep you erect. And supposedly, what was that story? He had this student Gampopa. Gampopa was a monk. And Gampopa wanted to see signs of realization. So Milarepa turned around, bent over, and flipped up his robe, showing Gampopa the calluses on his ass. That was his signs of realization. This is the earthiness of our sect. And he says, devotion to the lineage of the past gives you the feeling of the richness of your heritage. That there's stories like that, and there's zillions of those stories. And then devotion to the to teachers in the present gives you the feeling that those riches that you have read about are not mythical, but they're real. They've been passed down, and they're embodied and taught by teachers who are out and about today. So there are three ways of learning. Hearing, that's what you're doing now. Contemplating, that's you think about these teachings. And meditating. Of these, meditating is the most important. And these prepare you, you hear them, do all three of those simultaneously, as we are doing tonight, right? You're hearing, and you're thinking about it as you hear it, and we've meditated. And it's that combination, that threefold combination, that moves you along the path most rapidly. The first teaching that we're going to talk about is the 3 marks of existence. And of these, the first is impermanence. Now, these aren't intellectual speculation, but they're things that we see more and more clearly through the practice of sitting meditation. It's absolutely essential to sit. There's nothing transcendental about this. You just practice, as we did, seeing what's going on in your mind, in the present. This is called, in the Hinayana or Theravada tradition, the practice of bare attention. You're not thinking about it. You're just seeing it with bare attention, naked attention. And you develop a patient attitude to pain and boredom as you sit in practice, whether you're doing this alone, in a group, or in retreat, when you go into retreat, or in daily life. And this patient attitude toward pain is very important. We develop the capacity to endure boredom on the cushion. Now, at first, when we start practicing, the boredom is what we call hot boredom in this tradition. It's like you feel like you're going to fidget and you want to get up and run screaming out of the room. Later, it becomes a kind of cool boredom. It's almost like a balm. You're bored, but you can sit there. And what's developing is that you're developing the capacity to let your thoughts come and go and stay unmoved, like a rock, like a fortress. I want to tell you, there are lots and lots of people who can't do that, not for any length of time. So, for instance, there's a practice that we do. Trungpa Rinpoche copied it. He went and saw, he went to Tassajara and visited Suzuki Roshi there. That's the Zen Mountain Center in the Carmel Valley, Soto Zen. And there he saw them doing the practice of sesshin. Sesshin is a month long. You sit every day for alternate periods of sitting and walking meditation. Meals are taken in a ritual style. It's called oryoki. And that becomes part of your meditation practice too, because you learn these ritual movements of eating and handling your utensils and the whole thing. And he loved it. It doesn't exist in the Tibetan tradition, and he brought it in for his students, and we still do these practices today. He renamed it for his students Datun. Datun means month-long period of group sitting meditation. Da is month, Tun is period. And when you do that, you have to be able to sit there with your thoughts for a month, right? I want to tell you, I've been to many Datuns, and the Westchester Buddhist Center does week tuns. Week tuns are easier. We interview people pretty carefully now. Back in the old days, we sort of let anybody come. And there would be people who simply couldn't do it. Their thoughts would pick them right up off the cushion and walk them out the door. It's just... So what you're learning as you sit, and we all are learning, is the ability to just let those thoughts, they're just fantasies, come and go, come and go. They come willy-nilly. You can't stop them. And we just let them play out and evaporate and disappear. And we become much stronger people, much more solid people for our ability to do that. Because we're not moved by our thoughts the way so many people are as much. So, impermanence. The sequence is impermanence, egolessness, and suffering. He's talking about, he says, you begin to simply experience the rare occasion that you have to sit and do nothing. And this is the approach of a Kusulu. This is Kusulu practice. Kusulus are yogis who do nothing but, as Trungpa Rinpoche put it, pardon me, eat, shit, sleep, and meditate. That's what you do when you do Kusulu practice. And if you go into retreat, Lane has done a solitary retreat. Anybody else done solitary retreats here? No? Rochelle and Sasha? No? I really recommend it at some point. Work it out with your meditation instructor. I mean, it's a rare experience to be alone with your own mind, with no entertainment. You see, when you go into solitary retreat, you take no books. You take maybe one Dharma book and only read it for a little bit in the evenings for inspiration, but you're not studying. No writing, no music, no communication, with the outside world, unless you get ill or something is necessary, or somebody needs to communicate with you because there's a crisis. And basically, you just do Kusulu practice. Eat, shit, sleep, and meditate. And it's interesting what happens, the changes that you go through, and how you appreciate things differently. One thing that always happens for me is that and not to be crude about it, but having a bowel movement becomes a real form of entertainment because there's nothing else happening. There's just not much going on. You meditate for a minimum, in our tradition, of 8 hours a day. Right? So anyhow, it's a terrific practice. I always find that, for me anyhow, my perspective changes. And what I thought was so important when I went in recedes, and what the little things become much more important in my life, emerge into vividness and importance. And you deepen your practice. So you begin to realize, you see, the more you practice, that you can't hold on to anything, psychologically or experientially. Everything is going. And in fact, the older you get, the more pronounced that realization and poignant and painful it becomes. Because, no matter how old you get, your mind is still the mind of a 20-year-old or a 25-year-old or whatever it is you want to pick. You just look in the mirror and you're amazed, I feel like I want to find out, who can I sue? Who did this? When did this happen? This change, and it's so you can't hold on to anything psychologically. Everything changes. People you love leave. The money that you thought you had goes. Whatever, your health that you were holding on to changes and maybe disintegrates. All kinds of things. You lose stuff that you cherished. Friends disappear. The older you get, the more friends are going. Oh my gosh, I know so many people because I'm in the Buddhist community. Every time I turn around, somebody else is dead or dying. And there's no place for real rest or security. The rug is constantly moving out from under your feet. This is the meaning of impermanence. He says the shiftiness or slipperiness of psychological existence is a more fundamental level of impermanence. You can't cling or hold on to anything. It all eludes your grasp. It's like a rushing river. You have nothing to hold on to. And he calls this, beginning to realize this and make accommodation with this, developing an empty heart. I find it so difficult and heartbreaking. There's so much that happens for each one of us. Losses that we have to endure. He says, so there's a tremendous sense of groundlessness. You are fully and utterly haunted at some point. Now, it may not be today, but it may happen. You feel haunted by the utter transience. Everything that you value and hold on to changes, and a lot of it disappears. Egolessness, then, the second one. He said basically ego is a psychological bank, a pool, in which we store our memories and ideas, memories of the past, so that whenever we're running out of external entertainment, we could churn them out and entertain ourselves, like an animal regurgitating, like, a cow regurgitating its food so that it can chew it. That's what we do. We sit, especially when we sit, right? We're so bored. And we sit, and out comes all this stuff from inside our minds. This pool that he's talking about actually has a name. It's the eighth consciousness, the eighth samsaric consciousness. It's called the Alaya Vijnana, the Alaya consciousness. And in it are stored all our memories. They're stored in there as seeds, bijas in Sanskrit. And these seeds are in embryo. They're full of potential, but they're not born. They haven't sprouted yet. Until either something just kicks them out, which can happen at random. Suddenly you're thinking about somebody you never thought about in years, right? Or something happens in the external world that keys that memory. and it brings it to life, and suddenly you're remembering something. You see a person who reminds you of your mother, and your mother comes into the room, keyed out of your ollie or your pool. And he says the purpose of ego, of this pool of these memories, is to keep ego alive, to keep it entertained. Ego needs them because we're always looking for some proof that I'm here. Me and my other, me and my shoes, me and my lover, me and my whatever it might be, my health. And we have this thing out there that proves that I'm here. And so the ollie is constantly churning this stuff out because we don't want to feel that groundlessness of not having something to relate to. The very essence of ego is that it's always in an I-other relation. That's there, so I'm here. I like that, I want to pull it to me. I don't like that, I want to push it away from me. I don't care about that, I stay in the same distance. And we're constantly in these I-other relational problems. And it's entertaining. Once I heard somebody ask Rinpoche, what is the purpose of fear? And he said, the purpose of fear is to prove that I exist. That's a beaut. So you can contemplate that one. Because we don't need it. We can just come back into the present moment like we did in our meditation practice. This open space of awareness. And then he says, so at some point, you begin to realize that there is no one to keep you company and you have nothing to hold on to. He said, this egolessness, from a contemplative point of view, is the alarm created by the experience of empty heart. The empty heart experience is that you can't hold on to anything because everything's impermanent. And the egolessness is like you suddenly realize if you can't hold on to anything, who am I? Who is this person who wants to hold on to things but can't? He calls it the double take created from the realization of impermanence. He said it could produce a faint sense of anger. You could be pissed off that you don't have an I to relate to. It is so alarming, so bad, like a distasteful joke that one has played on oneself. And there's a further sense of lost, a total sense of poverty. And I'm sure that there are people in this room who haven't felt that. And I'm sure that there are some people in this room who have. That sense of lost, of sorrow for not owning what you wanted to own. And it might be the love of another person. It might be the love of other people. It might be a physical situation, wealth, health, all kinds of things. And that sense of being lost because you've lost your reference point and you're poor in a way that you never wanted to be, never thought you might be. Which brings us to suffering. As if we weren't there already. He said, the suffering is so acute, so oppressive, and so painful, and it's because suffering has no root, no case history. It just comes along with all of the impermanence and the egolessness that went before. He says, suffering is in fact indestructible and self-existent. Now there's a scary statement. Therefore, it happens to be real, unlike the non-existence of ego. Ego is not real. Ego is just a fiction, a false statement, a lie. But suffering is real. It's happening. It's the most real thing in one's realm of existence. The idea of the path is that you don't fight back at the suffering, but you learn to make yourself at home with the suffering, that reality is suffering. There's a thought. That you learn to make yourself at home with suffering. And you might say, well, if I do that, then I'll get rid of it. That isn't it. It's a complete acceptance of the suffering as part of your world. He says the realization of suffering is the starting point, is the seed of awakening. That's why it is called the first noble truth. It's for ordinary people, people on the path of accumulation, like us. He says, as practitioners, we begin to discover that there is no permanent experience and no ego. These practitioners realize that the whole world is made only out of suffering. There's no self, there's nothing permanent, there's just this experience of suffering. And that is the definition of samsara, confusion. It just goes on and around and on and around. He says even seemingly pleasurable things are actually pain. And they bring more pain. And the reason that these things are pain is because they contain within them, these pleasurable moments, the desire to grasp and hold on and keep it from fleeting, because we know that they're going to pass away. They slip through our fingers. And it makes us feel somewhat claustrophobic, that we can't actually solidify this pleasure and rest in it. He says, suffering is so full and egolessness is so desolate. Somehow or other you begin to become involved with the realness of the pain. And then you begin to go on with the Four Noble Truths. He says that the experience of pain is immediate, like putting your hand on burning metal without wearing gloves. So that's how the practitioner sees the world at the first stage of the path of accumulation. And this is the vipassana experience of impermanence, egolessness, and suffering in the fullest sense. This is why it's so important for us to practice, have a daily practice. And believe me, I've struggled with that for years, and I regret it, not having a strong daily practice. But to have a strong daily practice, and you just sit and you do it, and then you take it out into the world as well. This open awareness, the vipassana awareness, you can take it out into your daily life more and more. What it takes to do that is you have to be able to remember to come back to awareness, because we get so caught up in one thing or another as we walk the streets, as we talk with our friends. The key to bring it back into daily life is first that you sit and you do it on the cushion, so you have a deeper and deeper experience of it, and then as you walk down the street, you remember to come back to this open awareness. And as you do that, your appreciation of these three marks, of the impermanence, that everything is just fleeting all the time, and that there is, in fact, there's no ego, that what we think of as this I is just this empty story that we tell ourselves, and as soon as we start talking about the I, we've lost awareness. Now we're lost in some dream about me and my success, me and my failure, me and my hopes, me and my fears, and we've lost awareness. And then when we come back, all we have to do to experience egolessness is come back fully to the present moment. That's space. And then there's no room for I. I evaporates, just like these words. In fact, that's what it is. It's just another word. And then finally, the appreciation of suffering. That suffering permeates our lives. He says, this is just like hammering. Without the practice of meditation, sitting and in life, one is not moving along at all on the path. Have to do it. It's coming back to awareness. It's seeing things as they truly are, without an overlay of interpretation or concept. So all of these words that I'm saying now, it's not like you carry them around and try and go find it. It's more like, as we study this stuff, it echoes. We're walking on the street and we experience suffering, and suddenly we realize this is the suffering that was described. Or we experience impermanence, the loss of whatever it might be. And we hear the teachings echoing. They come back to us. Because we're seeing it, seeing the world clearly. He says, you need meditation. He says, study alone is like revving your engine without putting the car into gear. That's a good analogy, huh? So you can't just study. Meditation in everyday life is what makes it move. So when you sit on the cushion, what you're doing is you're preparing yourself for bringing your meditation into your everyday life. It's like a lab, experience. Go into the lab and you learn how different principles, and then you see them in action in the world. He says, just to drive it home again, Vipassana in particular becomes very prominent. It brings you into a full human being, so to speak, a complete human being who is worthy of following the path. It sharpens the intellect and heightens the awareness. And then he talks about these two different traditions of one is more oriented towards practice and the other is more oriented towards study. So there were some prototypical great Indian teachers. Asanga, the guy who founded the Yogacara school, mind-only school, two are almost the same, of Buddhism, represents the practice tradition. And Nagarjuna, who founded the Madhyamaka school, which is very logical, philosophical, really involved with thought, represents the intellectual tradition. These are embodied, the emphasis on these two styles is embodied in the sects of Tibetan Buddhism. So there are 4 sects, and Trungpa Rinpoche, in fact everybody on this shrine, belong to either the Kagyu sect or the Nyingma sect. And these are very, very practice-oriented sects. They still study, but their emphasis is on practice, kusulu practice. The Gelugpa and the Sakya sects traditionally were more oriented toward intellectual pursuits and study, although they still practice too. It's just a matter of emphasis. You need both. And he says finally, you might renounce samsara, the nauseating, neurotic, samsaric world, even though you haven't yet seen the alternative, but you want to get away from this. And then he says, at this point we could say that the whole approach becomes somewhat goal-oriented. On the path of accumulation, a goal exists, and a journey exists. There is a direction. You're choosing nirvana as opposed to samsara. But if you try to run away from samsara, the very act of running away becomes in itself a samsaric act. So you're pursuing another goal. Renunciation has to be unconditional renunciation. And the way you practice unconditional renunciation without any conditions is only one way, and that's with Vipassana meditation, coming back fully into the present moment. Every time you do that, you give up all conditions, all reference points, all goals. Those things only obscure it. Great stuff, huh? He really drives this point home. We're so lucky to have this practice, this Vipassana practice. I feel like it's the practice of life. It's like somebody's turning on the juice of life when you practice Vipassana. Back in the day, when people were taking a lot of acid, back in the 60s, and people would go on bad trips, and you'd watch a person on a bad trip, so-called. And what was happening was that they were getting lost in really, really painful dreams, utterly lost. They couldn't get out of it. It becomes like a prison. And you watch the color go right out of their cheeks. You remember, there are people who've seen this, and the life go out of the eyes. And then, as the drug wore off, they'd come back. And the bloom would come back into the cheeks, and the light would come back into the person's eyes as they came back out of that terrible place. Well, that's an exaggeration of what we experience in the course of our ordinary lives, but it's the same thing. When we get lost in these tortured sufferings, the bloom is leaving our cheeks and the light our eyes. And when we come back into the present, which is what Vipassana is all about, we can come back to love of life as a kind of joy and appreciation of the world as it arises in this present moment. So that's all that Trungpa Rinpoche has to say tonight. And we could have a discussion if you like. And there's a mic over there. Somebody, can you get the mic, Marie? Thanks. Thank you. Huh? There are two mics. The one that you can press the bottom of. That's it. Anybody want to say anything? Marie.
You said that suffering is reality and we have to accept it fully. So do you have any specific techniques on how to make peace with a loss of something you mentioned, big things, not just thoughts or something, big events in our lives. Yeah.
I mean, the only thing that one can do is see it, and at the moment that you see that you are thinking those suffering thoughts, you are not. There's an awareness, a moment of awareness, and you can relax into that. But as soon as you try to get rid of it, you make it into something real. Because now it's something that you want to get rid of. And when you say, this is something I want to get rid of, you're concretizing it. You're making it into your enemy. And then it will dog you. You see? So really there are so many examples of this. I keep thinking of Milarepa, who I mentioned before, and how I use this example, so forgive me, but there's a song or a series of songs where he's plagued by this demoness who comes and tortures him. Her name is Tseringma, and he can't get rid of her. And he's trying to seduce her, trick her, convince her that she should go away or leave him alone or stop torturing him. And she just says, oh, you're just trying to get rid of me. And that's the thing. If we, what we try to get rid of, we reify. We make it real. So the real trick is to be aware, to act commonsensically, and to come back into awareness, Vipassana awareness, and out of dream. But really, I think at this point of the path, at this reading here, to some extent we have to embrace the suffering. And we have to take it to our heart to the extent that we can't get rid of it anyhow. Lane.
For me, what helps bear suffering is compassion, and compassion is it's such. What do I want to say? John, we were talking about this the other night about prajna and jhana, but the prajna isn't just wisdom as is generally understood. It's like a compassionate wisdom. It goes along with the knowledge and wisdom and experience that we acquire. We develop a fierce compassion that is able to bear all the suffering that comes our way.
Thank you. Well said. Well said. And if you want to do a practice that will help with the generation of compassion. See, compassion, the irony is compassion for others eases one's own suffering. Isn't that unexpected? But it does. And you have to each one of us has to just discover that for ourselves. On the cushion, there's a practice that we all can do called the Tonglen practice, exchanging oneself for others. And it's a generation of compassion for other people. And the funny thing is that when you do that practice, it makes you feel a lot better if you're unhappy. And you can do it for people who are in distress, people who are ill. You can do it for people who have passed, who have died. If you subscribe to the Buddhist idea that they're still moving on to their next life, you can help them in that time. You can do it for your enemies. That's really a tough one and a good one. To do Tonglen practice. See, when you do Tonglen, what you're doing is you're breathing in the object of your Tonglen's suffering, and you're sending out happiness to that person. And you breathe it in, and it's dark and it's hot. And you imagine breath coming in. You're taking on their suffering. It's an act of generosity and kindness and selflessness, really, on your part. And then you breathe out to them light, cheer, courage, ease, and joy. And you can do it for yourself. When you're in a particularly bad place, you can just breathe in your own suffering and breathe out your own joy and happiness. Breathe it out to you. But really, I find that's a great practice, but what I find is that when I do it for others, it has a really, strangely, almost counterintuitively, it has a positive effect on how I feel about myself. Carmen.
Couple of questions around that. I was wondering if Tonglen was a practice that could be recommended even to very early meditators or people who are just entering the path, the Buddha Dharma, because I guess the second part of my wondering, my question is that could be a dangerous way, I guess, of turning our backs towards our experience of the pain, or make something out of it, just to keep avoiding what is it that we're feeling.
The purpose of Tonglen is not to turn your back on pain, but rather to breathe it in. But I do think it's better to wait with a new beginning meditator until they get used to simply being alone with their own mind for a while. It's just too much. Really, you want to get a person, person just starts, and you want to give them shamatha practice. That's working with the breath, only with the breath, not space, as it goes in and out. And you see, the thing is that most of the people who come here have already done that because they've learned meditation in a yoga studio, or they've done TM, transcendental meditation, which is that. It's shamatha. In fact, Buddhists call this practice the common practice because it's held in common with the Hindu tradition, the practice of shamatha. But if they haven't, if they're just beginning meditators, you would start them doing shamatha. And then you take them into, once they begin to feel that they can sit for a while. I mean, a lot of people, come and they don't even want to sit for more than about 5 minutes. And really, sitting for a half an hour could be difficult. So you want to get the person to be where they're comfortable sitting with their own mind for a while, and that they understand the practice of shamatha, or maybe even shamatha and vipassana, but at least shamatha before you start doing Tonglen, because it's just too many complications, I think. Too much stuff. We want to get to the point where the shamatha practice is almost second nature. Where they sit down and they know immediately what to do. Don't have to think about it. It doesn't feel strange, new. Anya, there's a chair if you would like. Okay. So that makes sense? Yeah. Yeah, we just sort of keep it simple. One practice at a time, then add on. Cliff.
One of the things that I recall in the Hinayana scriptures is that Buddha had many times said that what he teaches is suffering and the liberation or the freedom from suffering, and that was his main thrust. So if life is suffering, then the only way to be free of it would be to be dead, and I think that that wasn't his suggestion that we all die, that this freedom from suffering is available in this moment. And when we do that awareness practice and just enter into the presence of this moment, as just trying to do at the moment, and I check, and there seems to be no problem whatsoever in that moment. Not in the projections into the future or reminiscences into the past, but in that moment there's a freedom of suffering, and I'm certainly alive. So whenever it's said that life is suffering, I wonder if it's a more subtle way to understand that, and there's more to it than just life is suffering. And I think that what the First Noble Truth was saying is that suffering is to be understood, which is different than life is suffering. So it's just my experience, it came up, and it's just my experience with that, that there is a freedom from it.
There is, absolutely. Whenever you come back into the present moment, for however short a time, there is freedom from suffering. And I think the problem comes when we start to use that as a way of getting out of suffering. Because then we concretize it and we try to hold on to it. And as soon as you do that, it just vanishes, it's little blips. And then we are engaged in what he talked about at the end of this chapter, which is the pursuit of the freedom from suffering, which is in itself, could be, easily, another form of suffering.
Absolutely.
So I think that what he's enjoining us to do, it's just like the ability to sit here on your cushion and let your thoughts come and go, and that you can be a fortress of not you're not moved. The thoughts come and they go, and they don't pick you up off your cushion, for that period of time that you've set aside. And I think it's the same thing with the suffering, that we are going to become a fortress, where we're going to become more than simply the thoughts which carry that suffering, and that those thoughts and all that suffering can come and pass through us, at least initially. Because otherwise, the danger is that we turn what we understand to be the escape from suffering, which is awareness, right, into another vehicle for suffering, another subtler way. And this happens on the path. Spiritual materialism, it continually goes through. Not only that, but when we do that, we're sort of going like this, we're saying, I don't want to see that suffering that I've got. That doesn't mean we have to roll around in it. It's just a matter of bringing awareness to everything. Everything. And that includes the suffering. And not trying to get rid of it. If we try and get rid of it, that becomes a big problem. That's the problem that Milarepa had with Seringma. It won't leave us alone. So I don't know, it's really a subtle, tricky problem, isn't it?
And no self, no problem.
Right. That sounds like something somebody said. Huh? Who?
Well, I think a lot of people said that. It certainly wasn't me.
No self, no problem.
It's the name of a book.
Yeah, there's a book, No Self, No Problem. That's right. Somebody wrote a book with that title recently. It's a real conundrum that when we begin to realize how to get out of suffering, and we begin to employ that to get out of suffering, it creates another subtler form of suffering. Because now we're trying to improve ourselves again.
Yeah, but that's why the three characteristics work together of no self, impermanence, and that's what dissolves the suffering. Like you said, the understanding and the insight into impermanence, the result of that is you see that if nothing is permanent, you can't have any identity, which is the car is identified because it doesn't change. Every time you went out to the parking lot, the car was a different color with a different license plate. You couldn't identify your car. So the same thing when you realize that there's no self because it's constantly changing. It's just something that's in flux. It's not there. Then there's no one to suffer. There's nothing to grasp. So the suffering itself dissolves because the suffering is created by the grasping, which the grasping creates the self creates the reification to reinforce it, and you have that cycle of samsara.
Right.
So it's just reversing the process. So when you say there's no attainment and there's nothing to attain, yeah, it's here, like you said before. I'm saying when we do that exercise, that meditation, it's not someplace else. It's just here, now, this.
It's good training.
Yeah.
And sooner or later, we may experience some extreme form of suffering, some happening in our realm of experience that we just don't want. And then we have to learn how to let that pass through. Those demons and demonesses come. And you can't talk yourself out of them with anything, with philosophy. You just have to ultimately really accept them. That's what Milarepa had to do with Seringma. He had to truly accept her. And when he did, then it all changed. But as long as, sometimes these things that are coming, sooner or later we're going to encounter things that we really, really didn't want. Probably, most of us, many of us. I remember my dad, who had a pretty good life, and his last words were, as he passed, "I never thought it would be like this." Sometimes it takes all the way to the very end for you to get some kind of a jolt. But I think many of us will encounter difficulties well before that. Rochelle.
Well, recently,
It's on.
A very old friend in the Sangha passed away. And before he died, he was living in another state, so I was talking to him on the phone and also on FaceTime. And
Also what?
on
Sorry.
FaceTime,
Oh, yeah.
you can see someone's face. So this is the difference between someone that was very, very practiced and who really spent most of their life as a very serious Dharma practitioner, and what they're like at the end of, when it's time for them. And he had a smile on his face. He was very joyful. And I just said to him, this is our friend Albert. I said to him, Albert, what would you like for your Sukhavati? It's the ceremony that we do when someone dies. So, well, what would Rinpoche like? Or what kind of food, what would be his favorite drink? Because when someone dies, you put the favorite drink and the favorite food on the shrine. So they're magnetized to it, and then I guess they come for their Sukhavati or something. So it wasn't about what his favorite drink was. It was like, what would Rinpoche like? And I said, well, I guess he would like sake. He says, yes, oh yes, I like some sake then. And then he said, well, what would he want to eat? It wasn't about what Albert wanted. He only thought about his guru and what he would want. That was it. And he was smiling, even though he was in pain and he wasn't feeling well. He was with his children, and he was very cheerful. And I thought, this is a person who spent his whole life in retreat, practicing, enjoying his life, and he wasn't really, mentally, he was very stable. So, practice does work. And really it prepares us for the path.
Thank you. Well, perhaps we should end here. We are going to schedule Bodhisattva vows at some point, and if anybody is interested in taking them, you have to have taken refuge. We're probably going to have a course, maybe at most 4 classes, and it'll probably meet at my house maybe, or unless we can find another space, or maybe on Wednesday nights is a possibility. So if you're interested, would you send an email to New York Buddha Dharma? You get the emails weekly, and you can retake your vows if you wish, and let us know, and we'll try and put a date on it, or a set of dates on the class, and then a date on the ceremony. Okay.
And also, a very great Tibetan teacher, Mingyur Rinpoche, he's a Kagyu master, and very famous for his teachings on Mahamudra. He will be teaching at the KTD's, the Karmapa's monastery in Woodstock on May 5th. That's a Sunday. And I think the teachings are from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. And if you call the monastery or go online, you can make a reservation. But he speaks perfect English, and he's a great teacher. He's young. I guess he's in his 40s maybe, and he's a great speaker and a great meditation master. So, and then also Punlap Rinpoche is going to be teaching in Philadelphia on, what day is it? May 24th, I think? May 25th? At a university, Melanova, or I don't remember which one. What? Villanova? Villanova. Does anyone know? And he's on the shrine. He's a great speaker and speaks perfect English. And he's the head of the Nalanda Bodhi, the center that we rent here.
It's at Tampa University, May 25, 10 a.m. to
Okay.
4 p.m.
Temple University. Maybe that's in another state. Temple University, May 25th, all day.
And there's another teacher, Chungling Rinpoche, who may be coming to here. To New York Buddha Dharma. He's teaching on April 21st, Sunday, online on Ocean, it's called, the Ocean Team. And he's going to be teaching about Yeshe. Yeshe is a word for wisdom. And it says, the 21st of April. And I'll just read you a little bit of what this says. It says who he is. He was recognized by Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche. That's that gentleman. Great teacher. He was recognized by him as the main tulku, it means reincarnation, of Changchup Ling Nyingma Monastery in central Tibet. When Rinpoche was 12 years old, he entered Shechen Shedra, and that's a school, it means a school at a Shechen monastery in Tibet, and completed his studies at the age of 20. Since the death of Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, Rinpoche's main tutors, Chungling Rinpoche's main tutors, have been Tulshuk Rinpoche, Drodap Chen Rinpoche. These are all really well-known, very old teachers. Taklung Satral Rinpoche, who I don't know, and Shechen Rabjam Rinpoche, who we do know, and he's a real friend of ours, Sangha, and he's Chungling's tutors. Anyhow, he is a lot more about him here in this email. Maybe we should send this email out to the list. And in any event, Chungling Rinpoche has done a lot of work with the Nalanda Translation Committee. That's the translators who were all students of Trungpa Rinpoche, and they do wonderful stuff. And I know I've talked to some of them, and they think very highly of him. So you might want to listen to him teach online on Sunday, April 21st, coming up. So we should end, and let's do the dedication of merit. Who needs the sheet? Cliff? Do we have it? No? Well, just fake it. By this merit, may all attain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy, wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great east, may the lotus garden of the Rigdon's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory.